The dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light of Dr. Elara Vance's cramped study, a silent mockery of her own stagnant career. 3 years. 3 years since her meticulously researched book, The Aryan Recension, had been publicly denounced by the Pontifical Committee for Historical Sciences. Her thesis that a core tenet of early Christian doctrine had been deliberately altered to consolidate power wasn't just controversial, it was, in the eyes of the establishment, professional suicide. Her publisher had dropped her colleagues had shunned her, and the title, Disgraced Historian, had become a permanent prefix to her name. The package, therefore, was an anomaly. It sat on her desk, a plain, brown paper-wrapped rectangle, devoid of a return address. The postmark was smudged but legible, Milano. Her name and address were typed on a simple white label, the font impersonal and clean. With a sigh born of weary suspicion, was this another hate mail from a devout critic. Inside, nestled in unbleached cotton wool, were 2 objects. The first was a key. It was heavy, cold iron blackened with age, yet intricately wrought with faint swirling patterns that felt more pagan than sacred. Its teeth were worn smooth, testament to centuries of use, or perhaps disuse. The second was a photograph. It was printed on thick, slightly yellowed matte paper, the image stark and high contrast. It showed a door, not a grand ornate portal, but a severe, forbidding slab of dark oak, banded with black iron and set into a rough-hewn stone wall. A single, stark keyhole was visible at its center. The lighting in the photo was dim, suggesting a place untouched by sun deep underground. She knew, with a historian's instinct, exactly where it was, the deepest, most restricted level of the Vatican Apostolic Archive. A cruel joke. It had to be. The final taunt from some old academic rival, reminding her of the truths she would never be allowed to touch. Her first impulse was to sweep it all into the trash, to reject the hope that was already treacherously flickering in her chest. But her fingers trembled as she picked up the key. Its weight was real, its age was undeniable. The photograph showed a specific, tangible place, not a theoretical concept. This was no vague accusation. It was an invitation. A dangerous, anonymous, and utterly illicit invitation to the very heart of the fortress that had exiled her. The hope was a dangerous flame, threatening to consume the careful cynicism she had built around herself. Was it a path to redemption, or a deeper, more final ruin? She looked from the discredited pages of her own book to the ancient key in her hand. The silence in her study was no longer empty. It was thick with possibility and thick with fear. Rome did not welcome Elara. It pressed down on her. The weight of its millennia felt less like a grand historical tapestry and more like a suffocating blanket. The ochre and sienna hues of the buildings, so often praised for their warmth, seemed to her like the faded, weary colors of old blood and dust. The cacophony of Vespas and animated conversations in the piazzas was not lively but isolating, a reminder that she was utterly alone in a city of millions, carrying a secret that felt like a bomb in her pocket. Her hotel room was a small, impersonal box overlooking a narrow alley, the sounds of clattering dishes and arguing neighbors a constant, grating hum. She unpacked nothing but a single change of clothes. The rest of her bag was dedicated to tools. A high-powered flashlight, a magnifying loopy, a digital camera with a silent shutter, and the key wrapped in a soft cloth and tucked into an interior zip pocket. Its cold iron presence was a constant, heavy reminder of her precarious mission. The instructions in the package had been as sparse as the contents. A time, a set of coordinates that led to a small piazza, and the name of a Café del Oblio. Café of Oblivion. The name felt like a portent. She found it tucked away in a shadowed lane far from the throngs of tourists clutching gelatos and selfie sticks. It was a small, shabby establishment, its windows clouded with age, the paint on its door peeling. A single, flickering neon sign buzzed faintly. Pushing the door open released a wave of scent. Rich, bitter espresso, the ghost of anise from pasties, and the deep, melancholic aroma of old, polished wood. The interior was a pool of dimness, the air cool and still. A few elderly men sat at small marble-topped tables, nursing glasses of wine and speaking in low murmurs that faded into the ambient silence when she entered. Their eyes, quick and assessing, tracked her progress to a booth in the deepest corner. He was already there. Father Carlo. He was even frailer than she had imagined a man could be. A collection of sharp angles and parchment-thin skin draped in a simple, worn black cassock. His hands, resting on the table, trembled with a fine, constant vibration. The beads of a well-worn rosary clutched between his fingers. His head was bowed, but as she slid into the seat opposite him, he looked up. His eyes were not weary. They were terrified. They were a pale, watery blue, and they darted from her face to the cafe's entrance, to the window, to the shadowy recesses behind the bar, in a frantic, ceaseless rhythm. The fear emanating from him was a physical force, thick enough to taste in the coffee-scented air. He didn't speak for a long moment, his dry lips working soundlessly. When his voice finally came, it was a papery whisper, a rustle of leaves in a forgotten tomb. "You came," he breathed. The words barely audible. "I was not certain you would. I would not have in your place." Elara's own heart was hammering, a frantic counterpoint to his visible terror. Her professional skepticism screamed that this was madness, that this trembling old man was a conduit to her final professional destruction. But the key in her pocket felt heavier than ever, an anchor to a reality her desperation could not ignore. "You sent the key?" She stated, her own voice low and tight. He gave a jerky, almost imperceptible nod, his gaze flicking to the door again. A lifetime of silence, it becomes a cage. But the lock must be opened before it is too late. "They told me my work was a sin," Elara said, the words escaping before she could stop him. It was a defense, a challenge thrown at his fear. "That I sought to undermine faith itself. Was I wrong?" Father Carlo's trembling fingers stilled for a moment, tightening around the rosary. A profound sadness eclipsed the fear in his eyes. Sin? No. A threat? Yes. The greatest threat is not a lie, but a truth for which the world is not ready. I spent 40 years in those tunnels below, Doctor. Not as a priest, but as an archivist, a custodian of silence. I cataloged what I was told to catalog. I ignored the doors that were not on the maps. He leaned forward, his voice dropping even further, forcing her to lean in to hear. The scent of old wood and faint incense. The guilt is a cancer. It eats you from within. But it was not just guilt that compelled me to contact you. A month ago, the pain. The doctors? They gave me a timeline, a few months perhaps. It focuses the mind. It makes you ask what legacy you leave behind. In the silence, or a warning. He paused, his breath a shallow rasp. His eyes locked on hers, the terror returning, but now sharpened by a desperate urgency. And then, last week, I found it. A fragment of a shipping manifest from the 16th century. This file. It referenced a special consignment for the Custode Silentee, the Guardians of Silence. It was a name I had only heard in whispers, a myth, but the manifest was real. It listed materials, lead sheeting, specific types of mortar, and one item, the first truth, for permanent internment. It was the final confirmation. The myth was real, and their purpose was to bury, not to protect. The name hung in the ratum, air between them. Custode Silentee. It sounded less like a title, and more like a verdict. "The vault I showed you," he whispered, his gaze darting over her shoulder again. "It is not on any plan. It was never catalogued. Its existence is its own heresy. What it contains..." He shuddered, a full-body spasm. "It speaks not of a father in heaven, but of architects. It denies the soul as we know it, presenting it as a flaw in the design, a spark of error they could not extinguish. It is not a story of creation, but of fabrication. He reached across the table, his cold, papery hand closing over her wrist with a surprising strength. They are the reason for my fear. They are not historians. They are janitors of reality, they raise. They silence. They are why you must be a ghost. If they suspect, if they even catch a whisper of your purpose, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The absolute finality in his whisper was more terrifying than any explicit threat. It is for a tomb, and you must decide if you wish to be a Smaug, the one to open it, or the one sealed inside. The iron key was a brand in Alara's palm. Its cold weight a constant, chilling reminder of Father Carlo's terror. His final, whispered instructions echoed in her mind. A maddening litany of turns and landmarks that led not to a grand facade, but to a forgotten seam in the Vatican's stone skin. She waited until the deep hours of the night, when the ancient city's pious bustle had faded into a watchful silence, the only light coming from the distant, indifferent stars. Following Carlo's map, she avoided the floodlit majesty of St. Possible. Peter Square, slipping instead into the warren of administrative buildings and high-walled gardens that formed the Vatican's practical heart. The air was cool and carried the scent of damp boxwood and turned earth. Her destination was not a door, but a flaw. A rusted iron grate set low in a moss-slicked wall near a neglected gardener's shed, half hidden by a froth of unkempt ivy. Crouching in the profound shadow, her black clothing making her a part of the darkness, she fitted the heavy key into a lock that was nearly invisible, camouflaged within the grate's ornate scrollwork. It turned with a protest of metal that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness, the noise seeming to travel forever in the quiet night. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic. She froze, listening, expecting shouts, running feet, the beam of a flashlight. There was only silence. With the strength born of pure adrenaline, she pulled. The grate swung inward on stiff, complaining hinges, revealing a black maw that exhaled a breath of air so ancient it felt solid, a mixture of cold stone, undisturbed dust, and the profound damp of the earth. The smell was of forgotten centuries, of time itself sealed away. This was it, the point of no return. A mix of terror and a fierce professional exhilaration seized her. This was the violation of a lifetime of academic exclusion, a trespass into the very heart of the institution that had cast her out. She was a ghost, stepping into a tomb of secrets. She slipped through the opening, pulling the grate shut behind her with a soft final clang that sealed her into the darkness. The silence that enveloped her was absolute, a physical pressure on her eardrums. It was broken only by the ragged sound of her own breathing and the scuff of her boots on grit-covered stone. Her flashlight beam was a frail blade, cutting a swath through the oppressive black. It illuminated a narrow, descending corridor, the walls rough-hewn and weeping a slow mineral sweat. The air was frigid, raising goosebumps on her arms. She moved forward, one hand trailing along the cold, damp wall for balance, her every sense screaming hyper-aware. Each step was a gamble, each shadow a potential sentinel. She was inside. She had breached the unbreachable, and with every step deeper into the silent, dusty corridors, the weight of what she sought, and the danger of seeking it, grew exponentially heavier. The silence in the subterranean corridor was a living thing, a presence that pressed against Ilara's eardrums and seemed to swallow the faint beam of her flashlight. She moved with the slow, deliberate caution of a trespasser in a sacred tomb, each footstep a calculated risk on the grit-strewn stone. The air was thick with the smell of chilled rock and the dust of ages, a scent that felt less like neglect and more like enforced slumber. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a rhythm of terror and illicit thrill. She was violating the most restricted archive on Earth, driven by a disgraced academic's thirst for vindication and a frail old man's desperate confession. The cold, rough wall under her fingertips was the only anchor in the overwhelming darkness. The sound. It was not the scuff of her own boot or the whisper of her breath. It was a faint, almost imperceptible shift of air, the subtle creak of weight settling on a floorboard somewhere ahead. She froze, her flashlight beam stuttering to a halt on the damp stone ahead. Her blood ran cold. She killed the light, plunging herself into an absolute, suffocating blackness. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself small, trying to become just another shadow in the perpetual night. She held her breath, ears straining. There was nothing. Had she imagined it? The paranoia Carlo had planted in her was a fertile seed, sprouting terrifying fantasies in the dark. Then, a pinprick of light appeared farther down the corridor. It wasn't the harsh beam of a guard's torch, but the soft, warm glow of an old-fashioned oil lamp. It grew closer, illuminating a narrow slice of the passageway. And then the bearer of the light came into view. It was a young man, perhaps in his late 20s, dressed in the simple black cassock of a clerical student or a junior archivist, but his posture was all wrong for a sleepy nocturne. He moved with a predator's grace, his steps silent on the stones. His eyes, reflecting the lamplight, were not drowsy but sharp, intensely focused, scanning the darkness with an unnerving alertness. This was no oblivious custodian making his rounds. He stopped a mere 10 feet from her hiding place. He didn't call out. He simply stood there, holding the lamp aloft, his gaze seeming to pierce the shadow that concealed her. Ilara's mind raced. Flight was impossible. He was between her and the only exit she knew. Fight was unthinkable. Her only weapon was the heavy flashlight in her numb hand. "You can come out." His voice was low, calm, and carried no threat. Only a weary certainty. It was a statement, not a command. The dust on the floor near the grate is disturbed, and you breathe too loudly. Defeated, her pulse roaring in her ears, Ilara stepped forward into the edge of this circle of light. She expected his expression to shift to shock, then to anger, then to the triumphant gleam of someone who had caught a prize intruder. It did none of those things. His sharp eyes took her in, her black clothing, the professional-grade flashlight, the determined set of her job. And his own expression was one of grim assessment, tinged with what looked like recognition. "You are the one," he stated, his voice still a hushed murmur meant only for the two of them and the listening stones. "The historian. Carlo said you might come, though I confess, I did not believe even you would be so reckless." Ilara could only stare, her mind reeling. Carlo's name, spoken air in this forbidden place by this sharp-eyed stranger, was more disorienting than being caught. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse with tension. "Brother Matteo," he said, his eyes never leaving hers, constantly flicking to the darkness behind her, ensuring their solitude. "I assist in the preservation of the more delicate collections." The pause was deliberate. "Father Carlo, before his retirement, was my mentor. He spoke of you, of your work. He said, you asked the questions others were too afraid to even form." He took a step closer, the lamp casting dancing shadows across his young, serious face. "I have seen things. Small things. Ledger entries that don't balance. Inventory lists with items that appear and vanish. A door, once on an old plan, that is now simply a wall. I brought these inconsistencies to my superiors. I was told curiosity was a virtue, but obsession was a distraction from devotion." His mouth set in a hard line. Carlo believed it was more. He believed there was a system to the silence. He thought I could be a lookout, an ally on the inside. I thought he was a frightened old man, until now. He looked at her, the suspicion in his eyes, now warring with a dawning, fearful resolve. "So, you were here, and I have found you. The question is, what do we do now?" Do I raise the alarm and consign you to the custodies? Or do I help you find what Carlos sent you for and confirm the old man's fears are not phantoms? The silence in the wake of Brother Mateo's ultimatum was heavier than the stone surrounding them. Alara's mind raced, weighing the sharp intelligence in his eyes against the palpable fear that had aged Father Carlo decades beyond his years. This was no simple choice between trust and betrayal. It was a gamble with her freedom, her life, on a single throw of the dice. The key in her pocket felt like it was burning through the cloth. Carlo believed the truth was worth any risk, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. He believed it was a sickness not to know. Mateo studied her for another long moment, the oil lamp casting his face in sharp relief. He saw not a vandal or a thrill-seeker, the same desperate, haunted obsession that had lived in Carlo's eyes, the need to know consequences be damned. He gave a single curt nod, the decision made. Then we have no time. This corridor is patrolled, albeit infrequently. Follow me, and extinguish your light. He turned and moved back the way he had come, his steps silent and sure in the darkness, guided by the faint golden pool of his lamp. Elara followed, her modern flashlight now a dead weight in her hand, her world reduced to the circle of light ahead and the chilling dread at her back. They moved through a labyrinth of intersecting passages, each more ancient and neglected than the last. The air grew colder, the smell of dust more potent, the silence more profound. After what felt like an eternity of twists and descents, Mateo stopped before a recessed, unmarked door of warped, dark wood. It was unlike any other they had passed, cruder, older, its iron fittings thick with rust. He produced a different key, long and skeletal, worked it into a lock that seemed to fight him. With a groan of protesting metal, the door swung inward, releasing a gust of air so stale it made Elara cough. The room within was a tomb for knowledge. Brother Mateo lifted his lamp, the light struggling to push back the darkness. They stood in a small octagonal chamber, its walls lined with empty, sagging wooden shelves thick with dust and cobwebs. In the center stood a single massive table of scarred oak, its surface buried under a continent of dust and the crumbled, leathery remains of what had once been scrolls and portfolios. The maps they had held were now just fragile ghosts of paper and faded ink, disintegrating at the slightest disturbance. The old cartography room, Mateo murmured, his voice hushed with a sort of reverent horror. Abandoned centuries ago when the new archives were built. Nothing here is on any current register. He moved to the far wall, where a large framed map hung crookedly, its surface a web of cracks and faded pigments. He brushed away a thick curtain of dust with his sleeve, revealing a stunningly detailed, hand-drawn depiction of the Vatican Hill's subterranean layers. It was medieval in style, with sea monsters sketched in the margins and Latin script flowing like rivers across the parchment. This is the official map of this level, he said, his finger tracing known corridors and chambers. Then his finger moved downward to the very bottom edge of the parchment. But look here. Elara leaned in, her historian's pulse quickening. Below the intricate web of known tunnels, the cartographer had drawn a series of chambers that were utterly alien. They were not linked to the main archive by any staircase or corridor she could see. Instead, a single, faint, almost invisible line connected them to a symbol of a door, the same severe, iron-banded door from her photograph drawn in the bedrock far from any other structure. These chambers were a secret nested within a secret, a ghost limb on the body of the archive. They don't exist, Mateo whispered, his fear now mingled with awe. Not on any blueprint, not in any inventory, according to every record written after this map was made. That is solid rock. Alara's eyes remained fixed on the illicit chambers. Carlo's ravings were no longer the fears of a dying man. They were a cartographer's marks on parchment. The vault was real. The path to it was here, in this room of dust and silence. And the terrifying truth it held was waiting. The air in the forgotten cartography room was thick enough to taste, each breath a lungful of decayed parchment and the dust of centuries. Elora and Matteo stood shoulder to shoulder before the ancient map. Their world shrunk to the frail pool of lamplight that illuminated the faded vellum. The depicted chambers below their feet felt less like a discovery and more like a summons from the deep earth itself. "It's a cipher," Elara breathed, her finger hovering over the cluster of symbols surrounding the isolated door. They were not mere decorative flourishes. Interwoven with the standard Latin notations were stark, angular glyphs that felt older, more severe. This isn't standard medieval cartography. This is a language within a language. A warning or an instruction? Matteo leaned closer, his theological training overriding his fear. The symbols, they are heretical. See this one? He pointed to a glyph that resembled a serpent consuming its own tail, encircling a single, unblinking eye. This is a Gnostic symbol for the flawed demiurge, the false creator of the material world. It was expressly condemned. Its presence on a Vatican map is a confession, Elara finished, her mind racing. The door isn't locked. Look! She traced the lines radiating from the door symbol. They weren't mere artistic rays. They were precise, converging on a series of astrological signs etched into the margin of the map. Capricorn, Aquarius, a specific configuration of planets. It's a puzzle, a mechanism. The key isn't for a tumbler. It's a component. The lock is theological and celestial. Matteo's face was pale in the lamplight. The alignment, it corresponds to the great conjunction of 1603, when Jupiter and Saturn met in the fire sign of Sagittarius. It was a time of immense fear and apocalyptic speculation within the church. But the heresy... He shook his head, his voice dropping to a whisper of pure dread. The Gnostic texts speak of a pleroma, a fullness of divine light, from which humanity fell into ignorance. To open a door using that condemned knowledge, timed to an event seen as a portent of doom, it is not just a lock. It is a test of faith, or a renunciation of it. The realization settled over them, cold and absolute. This was no simple treasure hunt. They weren't just breaking a rule. They were attempting to solve a puzzle designed by those who had buried the truth. A puzzle that required one to first embrace the very ideas they sought to suppress. The key in Elora's pocket was no longer just a tool. It was a blasphemy. Can you calculate the alignment? Elora asked, her voice tight. From down here? Matteo nodded slowly, his eyes distant as he mentally charted the stars. The archives have precise astrological charts for every year of its existence. I can find the one for 1603. The mechanism, it will likely require the planets to be set to that specific configuration. He looked at her, the full weight of their task in his eyes. And you? The prayer? The invocation? Elara's mouth was dry. The words are here, she said, her finger tracing the sharp, ugly glyphs around the door. I've seen fragments of this proto-language before, in the most suppressed texts. It's a language of creation and uncreation. It doesn't ask for entry. It commands it. They fell into a tense, focused silence, the immensity of their task locking them in place. Elara began carefully transcribing the heretical phrases onto a scrap of modern notepaper, her hand trembling slightly. Matteo's lips moved silently, calculating angles and celestial positions. In that room of dead maps, they were assembling the tools not just to open a door, but to potentially unravel the world. The key felt like ice against her skin, and the silence around them now seemed less empty and more like it was holding its breath. The silence of the subterranean world had changed. It was no longer the empty, dusty quiet of abandonment, but a watchful, pregnant hush. As Elara and Matteo worked, she meticulously decoding the angular, blasphemous script, he mentally charting the cold dance of long-dead planets. The atmosphere in the cartography room thickened. It was a subtle shift. felt in the spine before it was registered by the mind. Elara first noticed it as a draft, a faint, cold breath of air that stirred the dust motes in their lamplight, tracing an invisible path across the back of her neck. There were no vents here, no open passages. The air had been too still for centuries.
She paused, her pen hovering over the notepaper, and looked up, her senses straining. Mateo, sensing her stillness, looked up from his mental calculations, his brow furrowed.
"What is it?" he whispered. She shook her head, unable to articulate the sensation. Nothing. A draft. But her eyes scanned the darkness beyond their small pool of light, seeing nothing but the deeper blackness of the archives. They returned to their work, but the unease had taken root. Minutes later, it was Mateo who froze. His head cocked slightly, listening. "Did you hear that?" He breathed, his voice barely audible. Elara held her breath. There was no distinct sound, only the profound silence. But within that silence, she felt it. A faint, almost sub-audible vibration. The echo of a footfall that was too soft, too measured, to be their own. It was a step that knew the darkness intimately. That belonged here. A new scent teased the air, cutting through the dust and decay. It was faint. A mix of old, dry wool, beeswax, and something metallic, like clean, cold steel. It was the smell of discipline, of preservation. It was not the scent of anything living in these forgotten spaces. Their eyes met across the table, a shared dread passing between them without a word. The Custodes Silentiae. They were no longer a rumor from a frightened old man's story. They were a presence. Elara's gaze was dragged to a patch of deeper shadow in the far corner of the room, where two bookshelves met. For a fraction of a second, she was certain the darkness there had coalesced, had taken on a tall, slender form before dissolving back into nothing. A trick of the light, her mind screamed, even as her pulse hammered in her throat. Mateo's hand, resting on the table, clenched into a fist. He was staring fixedly at the doorway they had entered, his face a mask of controlled terror. "Movement," he mouthed silently. She followed his gaze. The corridor outside was pitch black, but for a heartbeat, she saw it. A sliver of deeper blackness, detaching itself from the doorframe. A sliver that blotted out the faint reflection of their lamplight on the stone wall beyond before it was gone. It was the whisper of a shadow, moving with an unnerving, silent purpose. They were not alone. They were being observed, studied. The watchers in the darkness were making their presence known, not with threats, but with these fleeting psychological torments. A cold draft, a phantom footstep, a glimpse of a shape that shouldn't be there. It was a far more effective tactic than any shouted challenge. It seeped into the mind, eroding courage, amplifying every rustle of their own clothing, every shaky breath into a potential prelude to discovery. The work on the map, the decoding of heresy, the astrological calculations, it all continued. But now it was performed under an invisible, terrifying scrutiny. Every second stretched into an eternity of anticipation, waiting for the moment the shadows would finally step into the light. The oppressive sense of being watched was a cold shroud around them, making every rustle of their clothing, every scratch of Elara's pen, sound like a betrayal. The decoded phrases on her notepad were no longer just academic curiosities. They were dangerous incantations, their angular, ugly script seeming to pulse with a malevolent life in the lamplight. Mateo's face was a tight mask of concentration and fear, his lips moving silently as he committed the celestial coordinates to memory. "We cannot stay here," he finally whispered, his eyes darting to the doorway where the shadow had moved. "They are herding us, letting us do the work, perhaps." "We must move." Elara nodded, her throat too tight for speech. She carefully folded the notepaper and tucked it into an inner pocket, the words feeling like a live wire against her skin. Mateo extinguished the oil lamp, plunging them into a blackness so complete It felt solid. He guided her by the elbow, his touch firm and sure, leading her out of the cartography room and into the deeper labyrinth, his knowledge of the archives their only compass. They descended further than Alara thought possible, down narrow, rough-hewn staircases that seemed to spiral into the very bedrock upon which Rome was built. The air grew colder, damper, and the silence took on a denser, more ancient quality. The modern world felt 1,000 miles away. Matteo stopped before a wall that appeared no different from any other. The same weeping stone, the same patches of pale, phosphorescent moss. But he placed his palm flat against a specific, smoother section and pushed. With a grating rumble that vibrated through the soles of their feet, a section of the wall, perfectly disguised, slid sideways, revealing a passage so narrow they had to turn sideways to enter. The space beyond was not a corridor, but a cavernous antechamber, its ceiling lost in darkness, and set into the far wall was the door. It was exactly as it had appeared in the photograph, yet the image had failed to capture its terrifying immensity and aura of absolute finality. It was a monolith of black basalt, 20 feet high and twice as wide, its surface polished to a dull, non-reflective sheen that seemed to swallow the light from their flashlights. It was inlaid with intricate bands of tarnished silver, not forming decorative patterns, but precise astrological charts and complex geometric diagrams. Between these metallic rivers were carved lines of text. Not the flowing Latin of church doctrine, but the same harsh proto-language glyphs Alara had decoded, each character looking less like a letter and more like a scar on the stone. This was no mere vault door. It was a barrier erected not just to keep people out, but to annihilate the very concept of what lay behind it. The air around it was dead and cold, devoid of even the faint microbial life that haunted the rest of the archives. At the center of the door was a complex brass mechanism, a series of concentric rings, each engraved with the signs of the zodiac and marked with degrees of celestial longitude. At the mechanism's heart was a single stark keyhole. Wordlessly, her hand trembling, Alara withdrew the heavy iron key. It felt insignificant now, a child's toy against the monstrous engineering of the door. She slotted it into the keyhole. It turned with a deep, resonant clunk that echoed through the cavernous space like the striking of a funeral bell. The sound did not signify unlocking, but activation. The concentric rings of the mechanism remained frozen. The alignment, Matteo breathed, his voice full of a reverent horror. He stepped forward, his theological certainty overriding his fear. He studied the astrological bands on the door. Then, the configuration of the brass rings. The conjunction of 1603, Jupiter and Saturn in Sagittarius. His hands, steady now with purpose, went to the outermost ring. The heresy is in the interpretation. Church doctrine saw it as a warning, a call to piety. The text Kahlo hinted at, the Gnostics. They saw such alignments as moments of flawed creation, windows into the error of the demiurge. We must set it not as the church recorded it, but as its greatest critics feared it. His fingers moved with a delicate precision, turning the heavy brass rings against each other. The sound was a low, stone-on-stone grinding that spoke of mechanisms untouched for centuries. He aligned planets with constellations, calculating angles of ascent and declination based on a worldview the Vatican had spent millennia erasing. Alara watched, her heart a trapped bird in her chest. This was the first test. A test of heretical astronomy. If Matteo's calculations, based on condemned knowledge, were correct, the door would acknowledge it. If they were wrong, or if they adhered to orthodox readings, it would remain sealed forever, a monument to their failure and their doom. The silence in the antechamber was absolute, broken only by the sigh, agonizing grind of the rings, and the frantic beating of her own heart. The final brass ring slid into place with a deep, resonant thud that seemed to vibrate through the stone beneath their feet. The complex astrological mechanism on the vast basalt door was now perfectly aligned to a moment of celestial heresy. For a long, breathless second, Nothing happened. The silence in the antechamber was a physical weight, thick with the dust of centuries and the ghosts of forbidden knowledge. Elara's hope, a fragile thing, began to curdle into despair.
Had they been wrong? Had Carlo's fears been the ramblings of a dying man after all?
Then, a sound. A low internal grinding, like massive stone gears, long frozen, beginning to turn. A fine shower of ancient dust sifted down from the seam where the door met the wall. The key in the lock began to glow with a faint, eerie blue light, the intricate patterns on its shaft shimmering as if alive. It was working. The astronomical key had been accepted, but the door remained shut. The key was only the first part. The final seal was theological. Elara's mouth was parchment dry. She pulled the folded notepaper from her pocket, her hands trembling so violently the glyphs seemed to dance in the beam of her flashlight. The words she had transcribed were not a prayer of supplication. They were a series of harsh, guttural sounds, a Gnostic curse of awakening, a command for the flawed creation to reveal its hidden seams. To speak them was to spit in the face of every Orthodox teaching she had ever studied.
She looked at Matteo. His face was pale, his eyes wide, with a terror that was as much spiritual as it was physical.
To recite this was a sin that could damn a soul. He gave her a tiny, jerky nod, his lips pressed into a bloodless line.
He could not give voice to this blasphemy himself. His faith, though shaken, was still a part of him. The burden of speech fell to her. The disgraced academic, the outsider already cast out.
She took a shaky breath, the cold air burning her lungs. She began to speak, her voice a hoarse, unnatural whisper in the immense silence. The words were alien, ugly things, each syllable feeling like a violation. They spoke of the divine spark, trapped in the insective, trapped in the intexit.
Prison of flesh, of the architect's grand error, of the sleep from which one must violently awake. It was not a request for entry. It was a demand for reckoning.
As she uttered the final, simple word, the sound seemed to hang in the air, corrupting the silence. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the world broke apart in sound. With a groan that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself, the immense basalt door shuddered. A hairline crack of absolute darkness appeared at its center, widening with the shriek of stone on stone that hadn't moved in over a millennium. The door was splitting down the middle, the two halves retracting sideways into the walls with a deafening, grinding roar that shook the floor and made dust and small stones rain from the ceiling. A wave of air burst from the widening gap, knocked the damp, dusty air of the archives, but something else entirely. It was frigid, devoid of any scent, ancient and sterile. It was the air of a place that had never known life, a void that had been sealed since before recorded history began. It hit them like a physical blow, sucking the warmth from their bodies and the breath from their lungs. The darkness beyond was not merely an absence of light. It was a substance, a tangible blackness that seemed to actively devour the beams of their flashlights. The light penetrated a few feet before being utterly consumed, revealing nothing but a floor of smooth, seamless black stone that vanished into the impenetrable gloom. The opening was a maw, a gateway into nothingness, and the silence that poured from it was heavier and more profound than any they had yet encountered. It was the silence of a truth that had been buried not to be forgotten, but because it was too terrible to ever be known. The sterile, frigid air that poured from the open vault was a vacuum, pulling at them, demanding entry. It carried no scent of dust or decay, only a profound, empty cold that felt older than time itself. Their flashlight beams, powerful tools in the archived tunnels, became pathetic, guttering things, their light swallowed by the oppressive blackness just a few feet beyond the threshold. The darkness wasn't passive. It was a wall, an entity that resisted illumination. Stepping across that threshold was like stepping off the edge of the world. The roar of the grinding door faded into a memory. The replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure on their eardrums. Their footsteps on the seamless jet-black floor made no sound. The chamber was vast, its ceiling and walls lost in the consuming dark. The air was motionless, dead, and in the center of this void stood the truth. It was not a library. It was not a reliquary. It was a single object. An immense rectangular tablet of a dull, grayish-black stone that seemed to absorb the light, making it difficult to discern its full size. It stood upright on a simple stone dais, the focal point of the entire cavernous space. As they approached, their lights finally began to pick out the details on its surface, and Alara's breath caught in her throat. It was covered in carvings. But these were not the elegant flowing lines of ancient artisans. They were stark, precise, and chillingly technical. The style was not mythological. It was instructional, diagrammatic. Her historian's mind, trained to decode symbolism, recoiled at what it was seeing. The narrative was horrifyingly clear, a visual blasphemy that bypassed the need for translation. The top panels showed beings, but they were not angels, not gods in any human sense. They were tall, slender figures with elongated heads and large, almond-shaped eyes that held no warmth. Only a cold, analytical focus. They were depicted not in robes, but in form-fitting garments etched with intricate patterns that resembled circuitry. They stood around a table upon which lay a vague humanoid form made of clay or raw material.
In their hands they held tools. Not sculptor's chisels or divine breath, but devices that looked like crystalline probes and emitting rods.
Lines of energy, carved as precise rays, connected the tools to the nascent form on the table. This was not creation, ex nihilo. It was assembly, engineering. The central panel showed the result. Figures that were recognizably human, Adam and Eve, but rendered with a shocking biological specificity. The famed Tree of Knowledge was not a tree at all. Its trunk was a spiraling, double helix structure. Its fruit, glowing orbs that were being offered not by a serpent, but by one of the sleek, alien beings. The eating of the fruit was depicted as the transfer of this orb of light into Khus. The human figure, a jolt of energy that illuminated a network of lines within the body, a nervous system. It was an upgrade. An installation of consciousness. The lower panels were the most devastating. They showed the fall. But it was not a fall from grace. It was a systems failure. The newly conscious humans were depicted sparking with erratic energy, their forms glitching. The tall beings looked on, not with anger, but with cold disappointment, as if observing a flawed experiment. Some panels showed them containing the error, hurting the chaotic humans. Others showed them simply departing, sealing the chamber behind them, abandoning the project. Alara's hand rose to her mouth. She wasn't reading a text. She was reading a schematic. The story of Genesis, the foundation of 3 major world religions, was a user manual for a terraforming project that had gone awry. Humanity was not a cherished creation. It was a prototype. A flawed one. The soul was not a divine spark. It was an installed operating system with a critical bug they couldn't fix. The weight of it crashed down on her not as an intellectual concept, but as a visceral physical blow. Her knees felt weak. The air grew thin. The desire for redemption that had fueled her for 3 years curdled in her stomach into a nauseating horror. She had found the ultimate truth, and it was a cosmic dismissal. They were alone. Not because God was testing them, but because their makers had left the building, locking the failed experiment in the basement. She turned to Matteo. His face was a mask of utter devastation, all color drained away. He wasn't just looking at a stone. He was watching the entire edifice of his faith, his vocation, his understanding of his own soul, shatter into dust on the cold, silent floor. The silence in the chamber was no longer empty. It was the silence of the void left behind when meaning itself dies. The truth was not a concept. It was a physical law, A new and terrible gravity that seized them in that lightless chamber.
Elara's knees buckled, not from weariness, but from the sheer, annihilating weight of the knowledge carved into the stone. She caught herself on the cold, seamless floor, her palm flat against its unnerving perfection.
The air was too thin, each breath a struggle against a pressure that threatened to collapse her lungs. This was not the exhilaration of discovery she had craved. It was a vertiginous fall into a cosmic insignificance so vast it hollowed her out. Her life's work, her disgrace, her desperate quest for vindication, it all curdled into a sickening joke. She had wanted to prove the Church had hidden the truth. She had never imagined the truth was that humanity itself was the thing that had been hidden, a flawed product shelved by dispassionate engineers.
The divine spark she'd spent her career analyzing was reduced to a glitch in the code, a bug in the system of a creation that was never divine to begin with. The desire for redemption was now a toxic ash in her mouth.
She was redeemed of nothing. She was merely aware of the flaw in her own design. She looked at Matteo. He had not moved.
He stood before the tablet like a man facing a firing squad, his flashlight hanging limp at his side, its beam illuminating his feet and the endless black floor. His face was a ruin of faith.
Every prayer he had ever whispered, every sacrament he had administered, every moment of solace he had, taken from his belief, it was all being systematically dismantled by the cold, technical certainty of the carvings. He wasn't weeping. The horror was too profound for tears. It was a quiet, internal obliteration. The soul he had devoted his life to nurturing was, according to this stone, a philosophical error based on a manufacturing defect.
The silence in the vault was no longer just an absence of sound. It was the silence of the workshop after the workers have gone home. Abandoning a project on the scrap heap, it was the silence of a parent who has left and will not return. It pressed in on them from all sides, a tangible expression of their newfound irrelevance.
The universe was not a creation story with humanity at its heart. It was a vast, indifferent machine, and they were a spare part that had never fit, left to rattle around in a forgotten drawer. Elara's professional awe was gone, replaced by a primal animal fear.
This was not knowledge to be published, debated, or celebrated. It was a pathogen for the human spirit.
To share this would be an act of unparalleled cruelty. A psychic bomb that would not topple institutions, but unravel the very fabric of human meaning. Father Carlo's terror was no longer the paranoia of an old man. It was the clear-eyed understanding of a custodian guarding a biological hazard.
The burden was immense. A cold stone of dread settling in her stomach, heavier than the basalt door itself. She had sought to free a truth, and instead had become its prisoner. The silence they had broken now belonged to them, a terrible inheritance they could never unknow. The profound, soul-crushing silence of the vault was not broken, but rather displaced.
It was the subtle shift of air, the faint, almost imperceptible scuff of a soul on perfect stone that did it. Elara and Matteo, paralyzed by the weight of the tablet's revelation, turned as one. They were there. The Custodes Silentiae. They had not arrived with clamor or threat. They had simply manifested, their forms resolving from the deeper shadows of the chamber's entrance, as if they were part of the darkness itself. 5 of them, maybe more, standing just out of sight in the tunnel. They were tall, clad in simple hooded robes of a black so deep it seemed to absorb the scant light from the open doorway, making their faces impossible to discern. They stood utterly still, not blocking the exit aggressively, but simply occupying it. Their presence was an absolute fact, as immovable as the bedrock around them. There was no demand, no shouted command.
The leader, discernible only by being slightly ahead of the others, took one silent step forward. His hands were empty, held loosely at his sides.
When he spoke, his voice was not the rasp of a fanatic or the boom of a zealot. It was calm, low, and chillingly pragmatic.
The tone of a senior administrator stating an unavoidable policy.
The work is done, he said, the words flat and final. You have seen. The burden is now yours to bear, as it is ours. Elara's heart, which had been frozen in a state of horrified awe, began to hammer again, a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs.
Matteo took a half-step backward toward the terrible tablet, as if seeking protection from the very thing that had damned them. The leader's hood shifted slightly, his unseen gaze taking in their shock, their terror.
He seemed neither pleased nor angry. He was a functionary assessing a grade, assessing a mood.
Completed task. There are only two paths from this place, he continued, his voice devoid of malice or pity.
It was pure, cold reason. The first is an invitation.
You join us. You take the vow of the Custode Silenti. You forswear all previous life, all previous identity. You become a guardian of this silence. You ensure the truth dies with you as it will with all of us. It is a life of purpose, though a somber one. He paused, letting the offer hang in a sterile air. It was not a salvation. It was a life sentence in a prison of their own minds. The second path, he said, and for the first time a hint of something like regret entered his tone, though it may have just been the echo of the chamber,
is to remain. The door will be sealed.
You will be forgotten here with the truth you sought. Your absence from the world will be explained.
An accident, a disappearance.
It will be clean. It is not a punishment. It is containment. The ultimatum was delivered not as a threat, but as a simple, grim matter of fact.
Join the Order of Silence, and
live a half-life as its jailer, or become a permanent part of the exhibit you came to study. There was no third option.
no negotiation. The calm, pragmatic tone was more terrifying than any shouted ultimatum could ever be. It spoke of an institution so certain of its rightness, so absolute in its control, that it didn't need to raise its voice. The choice was theirs. It was no choice at all. It was a selection of their own tune. The leader's calm, pragmatic tone hung in the frigid air. A death sentence delivered with the dispassion of a clerk.
Join or be entombed. The options were not choices. They were different flavors of oblivion. Elara's mind, frozen by the cosmic horror of the tablet, snapped back into a sharp survivalist focus. The academic was gone. Only the animal remained.
Her eyes met Mateo's. His were wide with a terror that mirrored her own. But beneath it was a spark of defiance.
The truth had shattered his world, but it had not broken his will to live. A silent understanding passed between them.
They would not choose either of the custodes' paths. Alara's hand crept slowly, imperceptibly, toward the side pocket of her pack. Her fingers closed around a cool, cylindrical object, the magnesium flare she always carried for emergency signaling in remote archaeological digs.
It felt pitifully small against the immovable presence of the black-clad figures. The leader took another silent step forward, his patience evidently wearing thin.
Your answer? He stated. No longer a question now.
In one fluid motion, Elara ripped the flare from her pocket, twisted the ignition cap, and hurled it at the feet of the custodes. It erupted with a deafening crack and a searing, blinding white light that filled the cavernous entranceway. The effect was instantaneous and chaotic. The custodes, their eyes accustomed to a lifetime of shadows, recoiled as one, throwing up hands to shield their faces from the agonizing glare.
Their perfect silent formation shattered into disoriented grunts and stumbled movements. The lantern! Elara screamed at Mateo, her voice raw. Understanding flashed in his eyes. He grabbed the heavy, ancient oil lamp they had brought, its flame still flickering.
For a horrific second, conflict raged on his face. The instinct of an archivist to preserve warring with the instinct of a man fighting for his life. Life won, with a cry that that was part anguish, part fury. He swung the lantern against the base of the stone dais holding the terrible tablet. Glass and oil exploded.
Flame, hungry and orange, splashed across the floor, instantly igniting a stack of brittle, bone-dry scrolls that had been left near the entrance centuries ago. The forgotten notes of some long-dead custodian. The fire caught with a soft whoosh, flames licking eagerly at the ancient parchment, sending a thick, acrid plume of black smoke boiling toward the ceiling. The diversion was immediate. The blinded custodes, now choking on the sudden smoke, became a tangle of confused, robed figures, their calm authority utterly broken. Elara didn't wait. She seized Mateo's arm, yanking him away from the flames, away from the tablet, away from the disoriented guardians. They plunged not toward the main exit, now blocked by fire and confusion, but into the maze of deeper, unexplored tunnels that branched off from the antechamber, the very tunnels hinted at on the ancient map.
They ran, their footsteps echoing wildly in the narrow passage, the sounds of coughing and shouted commands, fading behind them, swallowed by the oppressive dark and the crackle of the fire they had unleashed. They had chosen a third path, flight. But as they fled deeper into the unknown darkness, the smell of smoke clinging to their clothes, they knew the path was paved with fire and blood. And the silence they left behind was now forever broken. The Roman night was a shock to their systems. After the absolute, sterile silence of the vault and the choking smoke of their escape, the humid air, the distant wail of a scooter, the scent of exhaust and cooking oil. It was a sensory assault. They stumbled from the service alley behind the Vatican walls, like ghosts ejected from a machine, their clothes reeking of smoke and ancient dust, their eyes wide and wild. They did not stop running until the golden dome of St. Favorite's Adair. Peter's was a distant accusing eye against the star-dusted sky, swallowed by the labyrinthine streets of the Borgo. They found refuge in the shadow of a forgotten fountain, its stone cherubs stained black with grime, the water in its basin a stagnant, oily pool. They collapsed onto its cold marble edge, their chests heaving not from exertion, but from the aftershock of revelation and flight. The adrenaline that had fueled their desperate sprint was ebbing, leaving behind a cold, hollow dread. Elara's hands were shaking. She could still see the stark technical carvings on the tablet every time she closed her eyes. The cold, analytical eyes of the beings. The double helix train. The sense of being not a fallen creation, but a discarded prototype.
The truth was a cancer in her mind, metastasizing, rewriting her every memory and belief. She had her redemption.
He was a cup of poison. Mateo was worse. He sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, dry sobs. The foundation of his entire existence, his faith, his vocation, his understanding of his own soul lay in rubble at his feet. He wasn't crying for fear of their pursuers. He was mourning the death of God as he knew him. The silence between them was thick with shared trauma. A news vendor's stand across the piazza caught Elara's eye, its small television tuned to a local news channel. The sound was muted, but the ticker tape at the bottom of the screen scrolled continuously.
She wasn't really reading it, her mind still trapped in the subterranean blackness, until one phrase snagged her fractured attention. She stiffened, her blood turning
To ice. She grabbed Mateo's arm, her fingers digging into the rough wool of his cassock.
Mateo, she whispered, her voice a ragged tear in the night's fabric. He looked up, his face ravaged.
She didn't need to speak. She just pointed a trembling finger at the screen. The text scrolled past again. A bland official statement in stark white letters on a blue background. Tragic passing of Father Carlo Benedetti, 78, a retired archivist. He was found in his residence earlier this evening. Preliminary reports indicate a sudden heart attack. The Vatican has expressed its condolences. The words hung in the air, meaningless sounds describing an impossible fact. A heart attack. Convenient, timely. Elara's vision swam. Carlo's terrified, darting eyes in the dim cafe. His papery whisper. If they even catch a whisper of your purpose, he hadn't been paranoid. He had been prophetic.
The truth was no longer an abstract, devastating concept. It had a body count.
Carlo was its first victim. His death was not a coincidence. It was a receipt, a message, a warning of the price of knowledge, delivered in the most final terms possible. They were no longer just trespassers or heretics. They were witnesses. And the custode silenti, these janitors of reality, were now hunting them.
They were carrying a secret that was too dangerous to ever publish. A truth that would not set anyone free, but would instead unravel the world. And they were carrying the certain chilling knowledge that this secret was worth killing for.
Their quest for truth was over. Now, their only purpose was survival, forever shadowed by the silence they had been meant to keep.
The safe house was a small, airless apartment in a nondescript building in a quarter of Rome that tourists never found. The walls were thin, transmitting the muffled sounds of neighboring lives. An arguing couple, a child's cry, a television game, show all of it. A bland, mundane soundtrack to their own catastrophic reality.
The air smelled of stale coffee and dust, a pathetic echo of the ancient decay they had fled. Elara stood at the small Formica table, the contents of her pack laid out before her like evidence at a trial.
The digital camera, its memory card a tiny sliver of damnation. The notepaper covered in her own neat script transcribing the blasphemous glyphs. The map tracings. The photograph of the door. Heavy iron key. These were the artifacts of her quest. The tuples of her would-be redemption. Now, they were just liabilities. Tinder. Mateo sat on the edge of the narrow bed, staring at his hands as if he no longer recognized them. The black cassock was gone, discarded in a public bin miles away, replaced by ill-fitting civilian clothes bought with cash from a nervous, hurried transaction.
He looked smaller without it, diminished, a soul without its shell. The silence between them was no longer the watchful quiet of the archives or the stunned void after the revelation.
It was a thick, resigned dread, a shared understanding that their old lives were already corpses. Wordlessly, Elara picked up the camera. She ejected the memory card, holding the tiny rectangle between her thumb and forefinger. It contained the only visual proof of the tablet, the only evidence that could give their insane story a shred of credibility. For a moment, the academic in her, the part that screamed for documentation, for proof, rebelled. This was the find of 100 lifetimes. Then she saw Carlo's kind, terrified eyes in her mind. She saw the cold, pragmatic gaze of the Custodes leader. She saw the stark, technical carvings of humanity's irrelevance. The fingers tightened. With a sharp snap, she broke the card in half, then again, letting the plastic fragments fall into the small metal wastebasket by the table. Mateo watched, his expression unreadable.
He made no move to stop her.
He understood. Proof was no longer the goal. Survival was.
Oblivion was. She picked up the notepaper next.
The angular, ugly script seemed to writhe in the dim light of the single bare bulb. These were the words that had opened the door to hell. She didn't reread them. She simply held the stack over the basket and lit a match. The flame caught the edge of the paper, curling it black, consuming the heresy one glyph at a time. She dropped the burning pages into the bin. The photograph of the door followed, the severe oak and iron blackening and vanishing into ash. The map tracings went next, the secret chambers and heretical symbols dissolving into nothing.
Finally, she picked up the key. It was cold and heavy, the intricate patterns now feeling like the brand of a terrible covenant.
This was the object that had started it all. The dangerous flicker of hope that had led to this suffocating room and a future of endless looking over their shoulders. She held it for a long moment, feeling its weight one last time, then dropped it into the heart of the small, hungry fire.
It did not burn, but it blackened further. Its purpose, its power, its history, finally and utterly spent. They watched until the last ember of paper died, leaving only a pile of gray ash and a blackened, useless key. The truth was not free. It was reinterred. They were not its liberators. They were its new jailers. The silence was no longer imposed from the outside. It was a choice they now made. A wall they built around themselves for protection.
On the small television bolted to the wall, the evening news was a blur of color and sound. Then, a familiar image flashed on the screen. The facade of the Vatican archives.
The volume was low, but the ticker at the bottom was clear. Small, contained fire in a lower-level storage area of the Apostolic Archive. Officials report no significant damage to any catalog materials. The cause is believed to be an electrical fault. No injuries were reported. Elara and Matteo looked at each other. No injuries, no significant damage. A contained fire. An electrical fault? The language was so clean, so sterile, so utterly devoid of the chaos, the terror, the blinding light and choking smoke of their escape. It was the language of the Custodes Silentee. The erasure was already complete. Their struggle, Carlo's death, the truth itself, all smoothed over into a bland, forgettable non-event. The report ended. A commercial for laundry detergent began, all bright colors and false cheer. Elara clicked off the television. The room was plunged into a silence that was now theirs to keep. They hadn't won, they had simply swapped one prison for another. Their lives were forever narrowed to the four walls of this room and the immense, terrible secrets they now carried alone. Together, but bound by a silence they now chose to keep, not out of devotion, but out of a fear that had become the very air they breathed. They